Hello and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host, Pushpendra Mehta. Joining me today are Paul Galloway, Senior Director, Advisory Services at Strategic Treasurer, and Jack Large, Editor of CTMfile. Thank you, Paul and Jack, for taking the time to share your thoughts with us on topics that impact corporate treasury. It's time to get some deeper insights from you on our topics for today, namely treasury fraud and controls, AI-enabled supply chains, supply chain sustainability, and the biggest US banks beating earnings expectations. Our CTMfile audience can read these articles and also research content more deeply by visiting CTMfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Let's get started with our discussion, our first story for today being about treasury fraud and controls. In times of tightened budgets and spending cuts at many organizations, more treasury and finance practitioners are expecting their companies to boost spending or fraud prevention than any time in the past 8 years, as per the 2023 Treasury Fraud and Control Survey report underwritten by Bottomline Technologies and powered by Strategic Treasurer, a leading treasury consulting firm. In a webinar accompanying the release of the survey results earlier this month, Bottomline Technologies and Strategic Treasurer discussed implications of and responses to the data. The Global VP of Fraud and Risk Management at Bottomline said that we are starting to see organized crime trying to hire into financial institutions and key positions in treasury, and especially in big corporations, because they know that actually hiring in is easier today. Paul, as a strategic advisor to corporations in the world or in the realm of corporate treasury, what steps can treasury and finance professionals, according to you, take to mitigate internal threats such as the risk of organized crime hiring into organizations as well as key positions in treasury?
Well, Push, just thinking about, fraud in general, it's not going away. The need to spend to prevent it is a necessity. Corporations can't ignore it. They need to take the steps to protect the corporate treasury. Now we're seeing new threats in the form of people disguising themselves as legitimate business people who are not. It's definitely concerning. When you think about things that corporations can do to help mitigate or prevent that from becoming part of what happens with their organization. Background checks are extremely necessary. The ability to confirm, validate, it's kind of the old auditor's approach, trust but verify. You got to take the time to do the appropriate background checks when you're bringing people into roles within an organization where they can have control and oversight of the corporate cash and potentially have the ability to fleece an organization of a significant amount. Business email compromise continues to be, number one fraud out there that we're seeing today. Social engineering following. What I hope doesn't happen is that we see, organized crime portraying themselves as legitimate professionals coming into organizations with the intent to steal. It's quite frightening to think that, these steps that fraudsters are taking are becoming more and more advanced. They're trying to assimilate themselves more and more so that they can steal. Organizations just have to be diligent in terms of vetting what's in front of them. So they see an email, they get something via some type of social engineering, whether it's somebody portraying to be somebody that's coming into an organization to fix something, but they're really not legitimate, or they're coming into an organization portraying themselves as an employee, prospective employee. Companies just have to step up to the plate and take matters into their own hand. This article talks about the human element, the social engineering, business email compromise, and having people come into the company as new employees who are there to steal. Just tells you that the human element is extremely important within an organization. So it's training your people in terms of what to look for. I alluded to earlier the auditor's approach to trust but verify. I think we've got to have steps in place. And when we think about fraud action that people can take, it's preparing yourself for that. Nobody wins if they don't have a playbook. You got to have a playbook. So you have to have a plan in place. You have to understand what are all the different types of payment flows. What do we do? What's our response plan? What do we do when something happens? And so this article does a great job talking about rapid response. Yeah, this is challenging for people because admitting that you did something that was wrong, inadvertent, not intending to do it, it's difficult to do that. Even though you may not have intended to do it, it's a difficult thing for human beings to do. But we got to have rapid response. It's the thing that's going to help recover the funds or have the greatest probability of recovering the funds. You can lock down the payment rail. You can prevent the cash from getting to the other end if you have rapid response. So having the plan in place and coaching your people, your team, to take the steps that are necessary to prevent the payment from actually leaving the entire system. Because once it leaves the system, the probability of getting it back is low. The other thing is thinking about how do you secure network drives that store payment files. This happens quite often. You'll see headlines where hackers will break into different systems, whether it's retail or whether it's a financial institution or otherwise. They're breaking in, they're finding where payment files are located, payment information, and they're stealing it and selling it or using it. So, you need to have these things locked down. You need to monitor it. You need to have an audit trail. You need to make sure that you have something you can go back to and hang your hat on in terms of we're looking at people's ability to access. We're looking at records. We're looking at rights relative to who should have it, who shouldn't. One of the other things, and this article alludes to, is the concept of, hey, a mistake happened. Share it within the organization. Don't hide it from the organization. I think it's really important because that helps people learn. It makes it real and it will stick in people's minds. So I think that's really important to do as well.
Yeah, the most important thing for me on this article was the paragraph about translate to action. It's all very well having a fraud prevention culture, but you need to translate it to action. The new dimension that this article brings out is that the fraudsters are trying to infiltrate their own staff into the organization, which is a new dimension. Staff have always been the biggest problem, internal staff, with fraud. This is a new dimension altogether. And that obviously requires more rigorous recruitment and so on. But the other thing that happens is if you have a fraud prevention culture and a way of life, this will expose the different pieces of activity that are illegal or building up to be a major fraud. A friend of mine was a corporate treasurer of a major company, and their regional treasurer in the Far East. He used to take no holidays and used to work long hours. And that sort of activity needs to be built into the fraud prevention culture.
The next story up for discussion is about AI-enabled supply chains being considered more effective than non-AI counterparts. Artificial intelligence will be worth about US $17.5 billion in the global supply chain management software market by 2028, according to a new market report released by researchandmarkets.com. According to the authors, market analysis shows that AI-enabled supply chains are 67% more effective than their non-AI counterparts, thanks to reduced risks and lower overall costs. Paul, how do you foresee the integration of AI technology in supply chain management impacting corporate treasury?
Well, Push, a lot of this is, still relatively new, and obviously artificial intelligence with Chat GPT has picked up a lot of steam and a lot of headline press. When I think about AI and what's going on out there, I can't fault Elon Musk for, asking the industry to, take a pause for a minute to say, hey, do we have the right controls in place for AI to do the things it does? That's the first thing at the back of my mind is, are the right controls in place to utilize AI for these various things? I think AI has a lot of upside potential. We just need to make sure we have the right controls in place. When we think about supply chain finance and the ability to support your suppliers so that you can get what you need to manufacture or produce the product that you have, anytime you have the ability to increase the efficiency of that part of the supply chain, the financing piece, I think that could be really beneficial across the board. It will make the relationships between the buyers and suppliers, I think, more enriched over time. I do think there's some things around the controls need to be buttoned down just to ensure that there aren't opportunities for fraud or the opportunity for something to go haywire and it doesn't work exactly the way it was intended. It was intended to do. I know AI, if you go out and you utilize Chat GPT, you request it to do something, it will come back with what you asked it for, at least based on what it believes that you asked it for. And it may not be exactly what you intended it to do. So the consistency of AI to do what it needs to do, I think you just need to fully test it and vet it to ensure that it's going to do what you want it to do and that you have kind of the belt and suspenders approach to ensuring that it doesn't go outside the controls that you want to have in place so that it can properly pay your suppliers with the right type of funding that you want to utilize, because there's different types of fundings you can utilize to finance suppliers. You want to make sure that it's optimizing the way it should. If the AI can produce that and have the controls, I think this could really be something that is quite interesting. I saw something in this article that, I'm just not up to date on, this idea of sell to customers, consumers, outcome as a service. That's a new concept to me. I think it's interesting, something that I'm not as familiar with, but it seems rather interesting. We're taking steps forward, new concepts or ways of delivering to our customers, and that's an interesting concept to me.
For me, that selling outcomes as a service is fundamentally, in fact, I feel it should be the primary job of corporate treasurers to help the transfer of companies from selling products to selling services. This is happening in major companies like Apple, where increasingly you buy a service rather than an individual product. AI is a dangerous tool and needs to be very carefully managed, and strict parameters around what it can and what it can't do I worry about AI. We're nowhere near as sophisticated and knowledgeable with its use as we think we are. I think we're in very early stages. But selling services rather than products is fundamental to the way business is moving forward.
That's right, Jack. When I think about AI, I go back to my days when I was much younger, watching a movie by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Terminator. Anybody that's watched that movie knows the premise that the machines take over, destroys humankind, or at least attempts to destroy humankind. Could you ever get to a point where AI is destroying things? I absolutely think you can right now based on what I know. I think Jack's right. We're early on in the AI realm. I think it's going to develop over time. If we don't have the right controls in place, the ability to control it, shut it down at any point, it could become a problem. So I think we've got to make sure we're cautious about using it and that we really, really understand how AI could circumvent any controls or parameters that we put in place. Kind of technology can learn. If it continues to learn and if it finds a way to circumvent something, that's where I think I have a lot of concern.
Moving from one story which is concerning, we move to the other one, which warrants discussion about supply chain sustainability. Despite 54% of companies being willing to prioritize positive environmental and social impacts over financial returns, less than 30% have made concrete sustainability commitments or set targets. This is a shocking finding from the Sustainability Commitment Paradox, a new research report by Standard Chartered. Faced with a lack of funding for sustainability initiatives, inconsistent data on ESG-related supplier compliance, and the concern of optimizing shipping to reduce emissions, progress for many companies remains stubbornly slow. Jack, what do you think are the primary reasons and critical challenges preventing corporations from setting commitments and targets for ESG and supply chain sustainability related expenses and investments?
The first important distinction was that larger companies are finding it easier to introduce these changes than the mid-sized companies, which is okay, it's a matter of scale, but it's also matter of attitude. There is more spare capacity for new thinking in larger companies. The other thing that really stood out for me was that Standard Chartered said they want to have more sustainable future while continuing to pursue their strategy, their strategic goals. And you can't have one without the other. What I see is that the strategic goals aren't changing, and they need to change to be able to encompass and get moving forward with the ESG commitments. Keeping the same strategy doesn't work if you're not also changing your ESG commitment. You can't do both.
Yeah, I think, I think there's a long ways to go on the sustainability side of things. Part of what I'm seeing, at least from a U.S. perspective, is we are still a capitalist environment. Organizations are looking for how am I able to drive the most value. They certainly have not bought into the idea that sustainability can be a value. I think until we get to that point where they can understand and realize sustainability can be valuable, and not just for large corporates, which, are kind of leading the charge, followed by mid-size. When you think about small companies, sustainability can be much more challenging, especially for organizations that are starting out, that don't have excess funds maybe to commit to sustainability programs. But there are things they can do to ensure sustainability through their organization, whether it's the people that they partner with to get supplies, organizations that they partner with to sell or grow their business, They can look for partners that focus on sustainability as a way to help them, reach some of those goals. But it's certainly challenging. I owned a craft brewery for about 7 years. We focused on sustainability through recirculating, reusing water, using spent grain. We would give it away to farmers to feed their pigs or cattle. We would do things in the footprint of the brewery. We were a small business to try to ensure that we could be as sustainable as possible. So there are things that smaller companies can do too. Hopefully, people can start understanding the value of it. I hope it doesn't become something where, hey, we're really far down the road in terms of we should have done things, decades ago, and we're not focused on it now, and now we're paying the price. Hopefully that's not where we end up, but if we don't start collectively as a planet working together, it's going to be a huge challenge. That means not only the US or Europe, but this has got to be in Asia and everywhere else. So the entire world has to embrace the sustainability or ESG and what we're trying to do to provide a better environment and sustainability to our future generations.
I, for one, couldn't agree more. Moving forward to the fourth news item for discussion, which is about the biggest US banks reporting bumper profits amid industry turmoil. The country's largest banks escaped the crisis that a month ago brought down two mid-sized US lenders, unnerving regulators and depositors. If anything, the tumult helped those giants rake in bumper profits. Jack, are you surprised that despite the US Federal Reserve's rate hikes, the economic slowdown in the US, and the recent banking failures, the largest US banks have managed to sail through the banking turmoil unscathed in terms of their corporate treasury businesses?
I think it's because of the crisis that companies have moved significant proportions of their business to the large players like Citi and JP Morgan and even Wells Fargo, who had a massive increase in revenue. Mind you, that was from a very low base because they had such problems previously. But the thing that comes out of this for me is how are companies, corporates, going to manage their relationships with these large banks as they become more and more dominant? I think that's one question. The other question, which isn't really a question, it's an observation, is that third-party processors like Stripe are now bigger than Citibank. The third-party processors have become absolutely huge. They're hiding what they do under various different titles, but essentially Stripe are bigger than Citi and the bigger players. The question for the corporates is, how are you going to manage this changing balance? Maybe small banks disappearing or you use them minimally, and how are you going to manage that with large banks and the third-party processors?
Yeah, Jack, great point on third-party processors. Certainly an area that probably is somewhat overlooked, for sure. When you think about those processors in the banks, and they've definitely collected a lot of deposits. When Silicon Valley Bank failed, Signature, others, people start getting scared. And so they're looking for safety, which is kind of a natural thing for people to do. Safety to them is equated to too big to fail. They go to banks, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citibank, all the tier one banks saw a lot of inflow of deposits. So they did get a lot of growth out of that. I think the question, and maybe this is kind of what Jack was alluding to, although, it's, are we going to see the smaller banks, disappear? Perhaps, but not entirely. I can use Iowa as an example. Iowa, we are a agriculture state. We have lots of small farm communities. They have small mom and pop banks there. I don't see those going away. They're not going to disappear because there is a need for people in those communities to have banking services. And Citibank, Wells Fargo, all those, they're not going to go to those small communities. Right. But it doesn't mean that smaller banks aren't going to take a hit on deposits. They probably will for some time. But the question I think we got to ask is, too big to fail. Is that a good thing? Is, injecting this concept of this idea of moral hazard, we're not going to allow a big bank to fail. We'll allow these smaller banks to fail. Is that a good thing? Right. I think we should question, these large processors. We should question whether we should have things as big as they are with a handful or several, controlling this much activity. Is that a good thing? I think these are just things we just need to ingest and understand whether it's in the best interest over the long term to have organizations that are that big. Some people would say, no, I don't think we should have them that big. Some people would say, well, as long as we have the right controls in place, we can manage it. And we have been, but, I kind of go back to this idea of something that I'm not a fan of. 08, 09, the Great Recession, we bailed out banks. Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, that was a forced merger. Government forced them to do that. Is that a good thing? These are questions that people need to answer for themselves, but I'm not a fan of moral hazard. It goes against what capitalism is there for, what it's instituted as. And so I have a hard time with it.
Important questions to ponder and think about. Finally, gentlemen, what is your choice for the biggest or most important story of the past week and why? Paul, can I ask you to answer that first?
Just continue to have concerns around what's going on with the war in Ukraine. We had a Wall Street Journal journalist that was arrested for spying in Russia. They just recently denied his appeal. This guy's not going to leave Russia anytime soon unless Putin's wanting to make a deal for somebody we might have that he has an interest in bringing back. But certainly have concerns around what's going on over there. Certainly have concerns around China flexing its muscle around Taiwan. Not a fan of Saudi Arabia is, in an alliance with Russia on oil now. There's just some things concerning around what's going on over there. I don't think we can take our eyes off of these different activities. Not overly concerned yet, but it's certainly concerning as you continue to see some of these things develop. I have a lack of trust in these countries.
I think this podcast has shown up two fundamental existential questions for corporate treasurers. One of which is, are they really going to allow the ESG functions and work toddle along without adopting their strategic ambitions? I think that's questionable. I think that's an important question. The other one, important and existential question, is whether corporate treasurers, I feel they should, try and get the company to change the focus of their whole business from products to services and change the way they work.
Well, both of you made great points. And if I were to add my 2 cents, I would choose payment fraud as the most important story of this week because I feel that corporates are under attack and treasurers need to respond. Given that fraud is on the rise, corporate coffers are being targeted by increasingly sophisticated criminals. So one of the best ways to protect your organization is to educate your people, is to up the human intelligence part and the training. Companies like securetreasury.com is an incredible training course, which does its bits to hone the training aspects in terms of payment security for corporate treasurers. So it'd be a good idea to go and check securetreasury.com. Nonetheless, thank you so much, Paul and Jack, for your informative analysis and valuable insights. We would also like to thank our CTMfile audience for joining us on this edition of Open Treasury. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTMfile or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.